Hello, everyone, and welcome to session 125, titled Harnessing Environmental and Ecological Data, Tools for Navigating Change and Sustainability. We have three phenomenal women speaking today, all of whose names start with M. That wasn't planned, but it's kind of cute nonetheless. What I think I'll do just to set the scene is actually read our jointly prepared abstract because I think it captures what we're intending to do in the next 59 minutes. In an era of accelerating environmental change and growing demands for sustainability, the integration of environmental and ecological data has never been more critical. This session brings together leading researchers who are at the forefront of statistical innovation and applied environmental science. And I'll thank the three of you in advance for participating and accepting my invitation. First up, we have Dr. Marian Scott from the University of Glasgow. She will be followed by Dr. Marie Auger-Méthé from the University of British Columbia. And then we'll end with Dr. Meredith Franklin from the University of Toronto. All of them will share their perspectives on the development and application of cutting-edge statistical and computational tools that illuminate complex ecological processes and potentially inform policy. Together, these talks will offer a compelling vision of how environmental and ecological data can help navigate the path towards a sustainable and resilient future. So without further ado, I'll hand things over to you, Marianne. Please proceed.
Thank you very much. Hopefully this will all work.
Looks good so far.
Excellent. That's the one I want. I want the content only. Yep, share. And if I now put it into, hold on a minute, move it along. Slideshow. Slightly, yeah, it's okay. So thank you very much, everyone, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I want to talk a little bit this evening in my time about some of the tools, the statistical tools and the data science tools being used to think about water. And the structure really of the presentation is just to give you a little bit of context about why I think water is particularly important, the changing nature, whether it's revolution or evolution in environmental monitoring, and what that is bringing to the discussion that we need to have about the statistical and data science tools. And I'll finish off with thinking a little bit about some systems thinking, particularly in the context of digital twins and some of the challenges that we all face. This is just a quote from the United Nations with respect to water and Sustainable Development Goal number 6. We've got 71% of the Earth's surface is water, 4% is fresh water, and only 0.5% of this is suitable for human consumption. Water is often undervalued, misused, and misallocated. And the scary statistic is 2.1 billion people lack access to safely managed drinking water, and around 40% of the global population suffer from water scarcity. So this really is a global challenge. And environmental monitoring, which is partly really what has driven much of my career, is critical for the tracking and understanding, and I suppose the regulation and management of the changing environment which we have, in particular in the freshwater context. And I like this quote very much. It was published in 1997, and it just basically says that there really has been an ongoing and considerable change in the nature of data. And this is increasingly true over more than a 40-50 year period. And increasingly we're seeing less focus on sampling and surveys and designed experiments, but more on actually just generating as much data as we possibly can. Now, what that means is that when we come to think about monitoring, we also need to think about how we maintain monitoring networks, how we design monitoring networks, and how we ensure that they are fit for often changing purposes. And these two images that we have here just show an example of a particular very large river catchment in the United Kingdom with many monitoring locations and how it allows us to understand the complexity of the, in this particular case, nitrate in fresh waters. And when we think about the changing nature of environmental monitoring, whether it comes from sensors in fixed locations, or whether it comes from sensors which are mobile, or whether it comes from satellite and Earth observation, then we have to think about how we fuse together those different data streams. And it's the diversity of data, I think, which is presenting many challenges to much of our traditional statistical inference. And this is just one of the examples that we've been involved in. It was funded by one of our UK research councils. It was looking at the river Ramganga in India. It's a huge river. We were dealing with data coming from satellite monitoring, 6 years of data, effectively high spatial resolution, millions and millions of records, and we were trying to use that information along with some of the more traditional monitoring, so infrequent sampling trips, very few locations along 300 kilometres, but something that we know quite well about how to deal with in terms of traditional time series. As I said, we had to think about tackling, in this case, we were using Sentinel-2, which is one of the European Space Agency missions. We had 90 million pixels, each one 10 meters in diameter in resolution, approximately 500 time points over time. We had, as I said, very limited in situ data. We had to think about how we could fuse together the in situ information with the satellite information to allow us to begin to understand how the pollutants we were interested in were changing across the river over time. So the different panels here just allow you to begin to see some of the complexities that we had to face, whether we were tackling something which was computationally very challenging and had to be dealt with not in the traditional way of inverting large covariance matrix, but thinking about fixed rank Kriege in particular, and so on. A more recent project that we're working on is called MOT4 Rivers, and here we're basically thinking about bringing together across the whole of the United Kingdom all of the routinely collected monitoring data, whether that be in pollutants in rivers, but also the biology in rivers, the catchment information, including land use, soil type, and weather, and bringing that together to begin to understand how we could develop intelligence about the impacts of multiple mixtures and cocktails of different pollutants over time so that we could understand better the sensitivity of the different biological species which live within our rivers. Hold on, not quite sure why this is stopped. Go to the next one. Oh, sorry. Yeah, probably because we have a very diverse data set here. We're talking about certainly over 20 years, something like 13,000 plus different monitoring locations. We're talking about hundreds of different chemical determinants. We're talking about sampling frequencies varying typically from weekly to monthly to effectively quarterly or 6 monthly. We have to begin to think about how to bring together all of these different types of data that we have with different temporal frequencies, different spatial resolution. We've been matching to the catchments across the United Kingdom, of which there's approximately 650. And we then have to bring that together with the biology stations. And biology in the freshwater environment is often relatively infrequently monitored. It's infrequently co-located with the chemistry. So again, we've had to think about spatially how we're thinking about matching things together. But we have to think about this in a systems context. And in a systems context, the framing that we're using is one which is known as digital twins, which are digital representations of systems, in this case, freshwater systems. They span multiple scales. Their purpose is to monitor and forecast and assess the system that we're looking at, and also to allow us to examine and explore the consequences of interventions which we might consider. So, in essence, we're using data and models and bringing them together, and we have effectively almost a looped system. So the data inform the models, inform us about the virtual system, but equally we can begin to think about the backward route to effectively how we monitor, how we intervene in the real world system. So a digital twin will have a model, but actually typically multiple models, many of them linked. They might be nested. We may have ensembles of models. We will have data coming from satellites, from sensors, from citizen science, as much as we possibly can. We need a means of updating the models using the data, whether this be through things like Kalman filters. We have learning technologies. So this is where AI is beginning to come in terms of machine learning. We need to be able to quantify and handle uncertainty. And we need to be able to communicate all of this. So we've been thinking very hard about visualization and interface tools. And all of this, of course, has to sit in some sort of computational platform to support the digital twin. And one example here is one that we've been developing as a digital twin for a river basin or catchment. So think of a catchment as an area in which we have rivers and channels. We have systems which are natural and engineered. So the engineered systems, we might be thinking about sewage treatment works, we have treatment plants, we have engineering infrastructure like bridges, and we have people. So we also have social systems. So the digital twin that we are developing has been built for two particular use cases, flooding and droughts, so water quantity, but then leading through into water quality. And we want to build these systems to allow us to explore the interventions that we might consider taking so that we can be evaluating their cost effectiveness. They're not being built at this stage for the general public, and they're being used for forecasting and future-proofing investments. We need data which is high quality, verifiable, accessible. We need to be common in our approach to data governance and to think about privacy and security. We have to deal with, as I said, multiple data streams across the infrastructures with different spatial and temporal frameworks, with different challenges in terms of both quality and quantity and gaps. So there's a very big data piece here, which I think reflects back to the argument that environmental monitoring has changed radically. In terms of water modelling, in this particular application, we have multiple types of models. We have processor physics informed, typically sets of differential equations. We have data-driven models using time series and networks. And we also think about hybridization, so combinations of both. Now, these can be challenging because the computational burden, particularly for the process or physics-informed models, can be high. So we're also building emulators. So in some senses, statistical surrogates or even AI surrogates of these complex physics systems. And these also allow us to run many multiple runs to allow us to think about uncertainty, which as statisticians we know is very important. Some of the challenges we have is thinking about how we calibrate and validate these complex multi-model systems and the uncertainty quantification. In terms of our uncertainty quantification, because of the computational burden, we're thinking about ensembles of model runs, often relatively small numbers of them, but emulation to allow us to give us surrogate models which are computationally more efficient. And then the hybridization is thinking about how we bring together both these ensembles and the simple emulators to give us hybrid models which will allow us to generate, I suppose, answers and potential solutions in, if not real time, then near real time. So digital twins are a way of capturing complex systems. They bring together our understanding of the systems which we need to think about, whether they be engineered or social or physical. But we need to think very hard about the different scales that we have to operate within these digital twins. We have to think very hard about how we link the different subsystems together, so the handshakes of the different models. And as I said, challenging indeed to think about how we calibrate, validate, and verify, and then quantify those uncertainties. So this drive to a more systems approach, thinking about water systems, whether it be freshwater or even marine systems, or heaven forbid, going from the terrestrial system all the way through to the marine system, is driving innovation. Driving innovation in how we monitor, new satellite missions, new sensors, innovation in how we then handle those diverse data streams, and the challenges that we face in thinking about the merger of some of the classical statistical methods with some of the more recent developments in data science. So as I said, underpinning much of this is also artificial intelligence, neural networks, etc., etc. So this is a very big global challenge. We are dealing at the minute with predominantly UK level challenges, which in and of themselves are big enough. But we do recognise that the systems approach is really opening up multidisciplinary projects, allowing us to work and to converse with and communicate with many different disciplines that are needed, but also to take that back to both our regulators, our managers, and the people who depend on our river systems. So I would like to thank you very much for this opportunity to present some of this at a high level work that we're doing. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues who are all involved in this, and some of the names are there. And I've shown you 3 examples of funded research projects, some of which are still ongoing, some of which are finished. But they capture, as I said, the excitement of the innovation, driving the innovation in the statistics and data science in this changing world, and the richness of data which is now available. So thank you very much, and I'll be happy to address any questions if anyone has anything. So thank you.
Thank you, Marian. That was wonderful. We do have a time for at least one question. You can either unmute yourself and ask it or put it in the chat. I don't see any yet. I just had a question. If you are teaching, first or second year statistics, and you're trying to or convey what a digital twin might be in a very simplistic statisticians, I think in general are used to talking about, okay, well, we're going to do a simulation. We're going to simulate this. Is a digital twin on a very rudimentary level something like a simulation?
So the answer is yes, but it goes a little beyond what we would typically think of the simulation, because critically, there's a lot of debate around different definitions of digital twins. But for us, the critical thing is that data comes in, we simulate, we have models, etc., etc. But there's also a backward loop. So there's a feedback back to the real world. And if you think about digital twins have been around a very long time, not so much in the environmental space, but if you think about an engineering facility, you have that ability to effectively simulate what your treatment plant would do, but then you can, as an operator, go in and make changes as a result of that. So there's always an updating, and it's an updating both of the model, but also back to the real world. So that's at the heart, there is a simulation, yes, but there's a little more packaging around that simulation.
Great. Thank you. That was very helpful. Okay. Well, we are right. Let me just check. I think they're. Oh, all questions must be written and not verbal. I apologize for that. I had forgotten. Okay, so I think we'll move on now to Marie in the interest of staying on time. Thanks again, Marian.
Hi everyone, bear with me as I set up my sharing. Okay. Hopefully you see the good part of my screen.
Looks
Okay.
great.
Okay. All right. So thank you so much for the invitation and the introduction. I was a postdoc in Joanna's lab many years ago, and a lot of the work that I'm doing now has been inspired by my time in Joanna's research group. So it's really meaningful to me to be invited by such a strong female role model on International Day of Women in Statistics and Data Science. So thank you, Joanna. So I'll talk about some of the work my research group does, which generally falls under developing and applying advanced statistical models to understand the behavior and spatial ecology of animal. My work is often driven by conservation concern, and that's where I'll start, so you get a sense of why we're developing these stats, complex stats model. So I work a lot in the ocean, and most of you are likely aware, ocean provide us with many goods. They provide us food, they provide us enjoyment, whether it's spending a day at the beach on a sailboat or doing whale watching. A lot of people like to be by the ocean. They're also very important transport routes, so a lot of our raw material, cars, toys, food come from shipping, and they provide us energy, whether it's oil and gas or wind energy. We get a lot of energy from the ocean. And because of that, well, the ocean is important for our economy, they're important socially and culturally. But a lot of these activities affect a broad range of species in many different ways. So direct catch can have a huge effect. So for example, many whale species has been hunted to the brink of extinction. But despite the fact that there's been a general moratorium on whaling for decades, many species are not doing well. And it's because there's many other threats that people are not necessarily thinking about. So, and a lot of these threats are associated with the very things that we enjoyed that I talked about a second ago. So, I mean, entanglement, for example, and food competition is associated with our need for food from the ocean. All of our tourism activities also have disturbance on the species that we're interested in. Shipping can be associated with ship strike, but also the transport of invasive species. And then a lot of these activities and energy activities in particular are associated with a lot of noise. And that's really important in the ocean because a lot of species use noise or sound to see their environment and communicate with one another. And then in addition, all of these activities are associated with pollution and climate change, which have, maybe more indirect, but very important impacts on the species we care about. So there's an increased recognition that if we want to safeguard the wildlife that we care about and that provides us tons of important services, we need to take conservation actions. So many conservation measures are spatial. So for example, in Canada, where I'm based, when a species is listed as endangered, it's illegal to destroy part of its critical habitat. And that means that areas that are assessed as critical habitat, so habitat that's important for the species, you can't do many human activities like build a factory, for example. So understanding where the critical habitat is important, and one way that you can protect it is also through protected area, and there's this push that by 2030, 30% of the world should be protected, including 30% of the ocean. And then there's other ways that are more kind of sectorial, where we want to balance conservation with industry. And a key thing is that space is important, but time is really important and more important, where we might not conserve an area all the time. We might just conserve it when the species that are important are there, right? So we can balance what we need from the ocean with what other species need from the ocean. So my research group is really interested in developing statistical tools to answer these conservation questions. These are recent students of mine, and we look at things like space use to get at conservation area, habitat use. But today I'll really talk about a subset of this, which is migration and the statistical model under it that we use very often, which is called a state space model. So we'll start quickly by describing what state space models are. Then I'll talk about how we can use them to get at better track, which is how they got developed originally. And I'll talk about the migration route of the longest migrant in the world, the Arctic tern. Then I'll talk about how we can infer hidden processes using state space models. And then I'll talk about narwhals, stopover site, and areas that are important on their migration route. Okay, so what are state space models? They come in a variety of shape and form. One of the important characteristics is that there are a hierarchical model with at least two equations that are linked: the process equation, which describe the process that you're interested in, and the measurement equation that describe how the observations are gathered. The process equation modeled the states at time t, so xt, so for example, where the animal is at time t. And it can be kind of split into two parts. There's a deterministic function, which usually models the process that you're interested in. And importantly, that function incorporates the autocorrelation. So it's a function of the state at time t minus 1. And then there's a stochastic part, eta t, that accounts for the fact that in ecology, it's impossible to know exactly what the ecological process is going to be at the next time step. So it allows for that uncertainty. Then the measurement equation models the observation at time t, so where you observe the animal to be with a tag, and it can also be split into two parts. So the first is a deterministic function that describes the observation mechanism, and it's a function of the true state, and it would account for maybe a systematic bias, for example, in your observation. And then the second part, the epsilon t, is the stochastic part that accounts for the measurement error. And here I haven't written the parts that describe the process noise and the measurement error, and for now you can think of them as normally distributed, but they don't need to be. So this is a way we can visualize the models where the arrow represents the relationship we're modeling. So the process equation models the autocorrelation, usually with a Markov chain. And then the measurement equation model what you expect to see given the true state, so the pink arrows. And the graph shows that we assume that observation, the YTs, are conditionally independent. And the key is that this structure allows you to differentiate between the process noise and the measurement error, and allows you to predict states value that might be better prediction of the true hidden process than the observation that we get. So one of the main advantages of state space model is that they're incredibly flexible. The deterministic part can have a variety of form. This is just a few examples from ecology. And the same is true for the distribution that we use for the process noise and measurement error. It can be a broad range of distribution. And here I've added the stochastic component as additive, but they don't need to be. I just wanted to make the point that there was stochasticity in the two parts. Okay, so why are state space model useful to answer ecological question? Well, GPS doesn't work underwater. And even for species that come to the surface, GPS technology is not particularly good. And for a long time, the only tools that we could use were things like Argos data, which had errors of about 5 to 35 kilometers. So here's a seal track in northern Canada, and it looks like it goes from Canada to Greenland into a few hours, and that's clearly not possible. So that's one of the reasons why state space models were incorporated in ecology. And one of the very first paper, authored in part by Joanna Mills-Fleming, who's hosting this session, dealt with this issue with a state space model. So the idea of this model is that the location of the animal at time t depends on where the animal is at t minus 1 and on the movement that the animal is doing between time t minus 1 and time 2. And if your gamma is close to 1, then you expect the animal to continue at the same speed in the same direction. And then the process noise, here a bivariate normal, allows you to deviate a bit from that deterministic part. The measurement equation deals with the peculiarity of the Argos data, which is irregular in time. So our process equation at regular time step, and then our Argos location are irregular in time. And what the model does is it assumes that the animal moves in a straight line between two time steps, and then we model the observation as a function of where it would be on that straight line with some error. And then the error structure can be quite complicated for Argos, but you can think of it as either a normal or a t distribution that changes with quality category. And so there's tons of state space models that are based on this one. There's some that are continuous time, but the general idea remains the same. And they're used a lot in movement ecology, but one of the things that when I started in this field is that it's really hard to test these models, because when you use them, it's usually when you don't know where the true location of the animal is. So I happened to be working on polar bears, and for these polar bears, we had both Argos location and GPS location. And so I could fit the model to the Argos data and compare it to the very accurate GPS location and see how good were these state space model on real data. And I guess I thought that maybe they would be good, but I was very surprised how good they were. So here's just an example. So the gray is the Argos location. The red is the estimated true location from the state space model that I showed before. And then the black circle is the GPS location. And you can see that they match really well. And it happens to be that in this case, and for the many other bears that I looked at, it worked really well, and because it's a good representation of the movement of these animals. So more recently, one of my former students, Joanna Wong, used models that were inspired by this one, with a little bit more complicated, using GLS loggers, which are different. They look at the location of the animal based on the light intensity at the time and on the temperature of the ocean. And she looked at the movement of Arctic terns, which are the longest migrant in the world, from 5 different colonies in North America. And she identified 3 different southbound routes, which were really close to the coast here, and 2 different northbound routes. So the colors here are the different colonies, and each of the little spaghetti is a different Arctic tern. And then one thing that she showed is that the current recognized flyways, which are kind of recognized routes that a lot of birds use to do their migration and is used for conservation action, don't overlap with these routes of Arctic terns. And this is a species that's not doing well, so kind of made a call for kind of focusing conservation in those area. Okay, so now I'm going to switch a tiny little bit. So we can also use state space model to not necessarily get at the location of the animal, a better estimate of the location animal. We can also try to infer behavioral processes. So the baseline idea is that the movement of the animal is going to change based on the behavior that they're doing. So here we have narwhal that were tagged with GPS data, so more accurate data. And the idea is that when they're not, let's say, when they're not interested in food, they might be traveling really fast. And when there's food around, they might do what we call an area-restricted search, which means smaller step, more turning around. And so you can use the movement track to try to infer the underlying behavioral process. So here, the process equation that we had before becomes our measurement equation. So here we observe where the animal actually is, because we don't have that measurement error. And the thing we're interested in is that behavioral, that autocorrelation, that gamma that we showed before. So in the previous model, we only had 1 gamma. Now we're going to have a gamma that changes through time as an autocorrelation. So here is just an example that I've simulated. This is from time 1 to time 5,000. And we can see that I've simulated, so it starts not autocorrelated to autocorrelated back to not correlated, and then we see the track in 2D, and we can see that when the gamma is very low, it's doing this kind of area-restricted search, and then it becomes closer to 1, it does this more directed movement. And here's a simplified version. You can have it so that the gamma is also a function of covariates. And what Courtney Short, a former postdoc of mine, did is that she applied this model to the movement of narwhals in collaboration with WWF to try to identify area on the migration route of narwhals that were important stopover sites to, again, kind of identify areas that might be important for conservation. So narwhals have 2 different migration routes. They're the ones that travel offshore and the one that travel near shore. And here the color that we see of the point is whether they're doing directed movement, so that's the peach color, or stopping over area, which is the darker area. And so if we focus only on those stopover sites, we can see, especially in the nearshore area, that there's these kind of high density area in those fjords where they spend multiple days. And that makes sense because it's areas that are known to have lots of fish, and it seems like the narwhals are stopping by on their route to take advantage of the fish. One other important or interesting point I want to make, especially in this International Women's Day of Data Science and Statistic, is that it seems like it's particularly the larger females that use this nearshore routes. And one of our hypotheses, we haven't tested yet, but one of our hypotheses is that many of the larger female have calves with them. And so unlike the males that can, maybe spend a few days without eating, the lactating females need to make sure that they have really reliable sources of food en route. And we think that that might be one of the reasons they're using these nearshore kind of hotspots, because they need to go to places where they know food is going to be. And then the last thing that Courtney looked at, and she used the same model to try to identify when they started their migration, so when they started to do that more directed movement. And that's like really important for narwhals, which live in the Arctic, because they're very sensitive to the decline in sea ice, and they live really long, like 100 years. And so we don't think they're going to adapt evolutionary to the change in sea ice. And so the only kind of hope is that they can adapt behaviorally. So what we're seeing here is that we have data from 1997 to 2010, kind of been into 3 periods, and we can see that there's a lot of variation, but that there is an increase in the departure date. So it seems that the narwhals are leaving later their summering area, and that matches actually the same change in the pace at which sea ice is receding in those areas. So that's a good news in some ways. So it seems like they can behaviorally adapt to declining sea ice. The only thing that's maybe a bit worrisome is that means that they're spending more times in area where there's more shipping, because those summering areas are places where there's a lot of shipping. So maybe good news for narwhals, but always still need to think about potential impacts. Okay, that's it. I hope I made a case that state space model are really useful, and there's so many people behind this work. I'm happy to take questions.
That was fantastic, Marie. I have to say, having spent the last few weeks on some committee work in health and hearing time and time again how women and sex differences have been understudied, I like the fact that ecologists are doing that and have been for a very long time. Seems timely to mention that today. So thank you. As always, amazing to see you hard at work and doing great things. I think in the interest of time and knowing you also have to run off to teach, I don't see anything in the chat, so I think we'll hand things over to Meredith, and wish you well. Thanks again, Marie.
Hello. Okay, let me share. Okay, do you see the full screen?
Right now,
Or is
we see your speaker notes as well. Now you're good.
Okay.
Okay, take it away.
Well, I just wanted to, yeah, I had to flip the flip the screens here. Okay, let me just minimize this part. Okay, hi. Thank you so much for putting this together and having such a great group of women speaking about their experiences with environmental data. So the title of my talk is quite long, but I wanted to kind of give an overview. It's a little bit more on the data science and AI side of things than it is on the statistics side, but I'm going to talk today about the spatiotemporal data science for climate change and public health, integrating satellite data, climate models, and physics-informed deep learning. So let me see there we go. I guess I'll use my mouse. Okay, so some of the current challenges in climate and air quality modeling for public health is really to characterize different sources and processes. So under the environment that we're in, we are experiencing heat extremes, wildfire. We also have routine things that might be interested in modeling, emissions from traffic or other industrial sources, and dust storms, for example. So these are a few pictures on the right showing some of these sources, either seen from space or from the ground. And one of the other challenges, particularly for public health applications of environmental data, is that we want to have data at a fine enough spatial and temporal resolution to examine health effects. And so, different studies have different outcomes to look at. Some of them are acute, some of them are chronic. And then we also have environmental justice concerns. So we really want to go from, point level data to sort of more exposure estimates over a grid or over a larger area, but still preserving the spatial and temporal resolution of the data. So that means that we want to make predictions many times where there's very sparse ground level measurements. So that's a challenge for many reasons. And then, of course, if we have a lot of data, as we are getting, and we'll see in a few slides, how much computing needs we have now. We have massive scales of data. And then also what I'm going to talk about today are some of the complex AI models that either incorporate physical processes or just that are incorporating a lot of complexity. So the computing needs are very high. So this is just a schematic. Actually, this is a relatively recent paper from Nature Climate Change that was really showing sort of the whole big picture about using AI and big environmental data and AI. I'll repeat that the concept of the digital twin in climate modeling. And so from this schematic from this paper, basically the takeaways in terms of the challenges that still remain is that we really have to address things like generalization. So we want to be able to perform well spatially and temporally outside of the training data. And then there's also interpretability that we need to care about. Of course, linking predictions to physical understanding. This is always a concern with AI. And then finally, uncertainty quantification, which we've also heard earlier today about, generating estimates of exposure errors or any kind of errors in our predictions that we make from these large models. So now I'm just going to talk about some environmental data and where we're trending these days, especially in applications in AI. And so one of the big sources for these big global data sets is the Google Earth Engine. It really sits at the center of AI-enabled environmental computing. There's over 90 petabytes of data, mostly from satellites, some climate models. There's tons of applications that they showcase on the Google Earth Engine. And then I've also highlighted here NASA Earth Data because I'll talk about that in a second. But basically, Google Earth Engine is a cloud-based platform for planet-scale environmental data analysis. Well, data storage and analysis. It has a powerful API and some tools for AI integration. And Python and JavaScript is widely used by researchers, agencies, and NGOs to translate these data into public good applications. And one example of this in applied computing is climateengine.org, which actually I just pulled this a couple of days ago, where we're looking at the difference between last year's land surface temperature and the 2013 to 2015 average from a satellite data. So there's, it pulls it from Google Earth Engine, does some mild computations on it, and then presents it. So this is really an example of demand mapping and data curation from the Google Earth Engine satellite data. There's also NASA Earth Data, which has full resolution research data for various levels of processing, and then Copernicus Hub, which has all sorts of Sentinel data, which is the European. So overall, the environmental data landscape is that there's lots of data out there, as we know. The Google Earth Engine has synthesized a lot of this together, but most of the data that it has is from various public sources, including the satellite data that I showed, like from these different instruments, VIIRS, MODIS, Sentinel. They also have some atmospheric models, MERA2, which is another one that's kind of a hybrid climate model, atmospheric model, which I'm going to show a little bit later again. Climate model forecast, there's the NCEP and the WRF. There's some of those data there, land cover data, and even socioeconomic data. So the main point here is that, yes, it's Google. We can access these data. They're pulling a lot of it from public sources, which is great, but we want to, we have these open data and open source data that we have, sort of shared these data and code and this tool and this API that we can use both for academic, public institutions, and the private sector that can contribute all into sort of this collaboration between all of these different sources to have this, advancing climate research, air quality research, and enhancing technology transfer. So I'm going to talk specifically about some of my research now using satellite data. and because this is very useful for, air quality, a whole bunch of different sources. And this just shows you that all the different sources of satellite data from places like we would expect: NASA, the Canadian Space Agency, the European Space Agency, NOAA, which is National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. And then you can just see a few images here of what these, or schematics, I guess, of what these instruments look like. So how does satellite data work? So the great thing about satellite data, obviously, are that they are polar orbiting, many of them, or if they're geostationary, they have this wide range of a view angle of the Earth. So we get a lot of data for a large spatial area. And they use passive sensors to rely on reflected sunlight or emitted thermal energy. So we can, most of the satellite data that we use in many applications of the atmosphere occur in this sort of range here, where we can get the UV channel, which would give us things like wildfires or biomass burning or flaring, and then we can get other, from the visible to the UV, we can get different types of gases, aerosols, cloud properties, other atmospheric properties. So in environmental applications, we're primarily focusing on these types of things that can be observed from satellites. And then this is just a list of a few of the major instruments that are doing that. And then to further my example of some of the use case here is integrating satellite data for air quality. We use a satellite aerosol optical depth, or also called aerosol optical thickness, which is a unitless measure of the extinction and scattering absorption of solar radiation due to aerosols in the atmosphere. We can source this, so it's not only all aerosols, we can source this to specific things such as smoke from wildfires, crustal dust, industrial emissions, vehicular emissions, and biomass burning. But again, in sort of the data science theme is that for many applications of satellite data, we have to combine them with other things like ground truth. So on the left, we see that these are dots that are representing PM 2.5 monitors. These are the monitors that are sort of available globally. We see wide swaths of the Earth that have very little ground level data. And this is just a picture of where I am now in Toronto, sort of the number of monitors around here, which we can see look like a lot, but actually, when we get into more rural regions, there's actually not that much. So the whole idea here is that we have this multi-source data synthesis, which we have some measurements or ground truth on the ground, but we also have to incorporate meteorology, which we might get from a data assimilated or a climate model. We have emissions indicators. We need to incorporate land use and all of these steps and process these data. And everything in green here on the right is showing all the steps that need to be done to process and fuse the data together before we can even do any modeling. So satellites really fill in the gaps, but it still requires a lot of expertise and data fusion from different sources of data to make this all happen. So now that we've fused the data to connect these environmental data with AI, so I'm speaking specifically about AI models today, we have all of these data, and then we have to incorporate the data science tools to sort of put everything together, but then the AI is really unlocking new insights, and it can do such at a planetary scale. And so we really need this applied computing research that bridges the data, the models, and then gives us something that we can use in action. And in this case, collaboration is really essential for us advancing both climate models and other environmental type models like air quality models to accelerate the technology transfer again. And we do have multiple players. And I keep talking about this because, yes, many of us here are in academia or public agencies, but we also, have to work with some industry for computing power and for even assimilating some of these data. And so there's multiple players here when it comes to the air quality and AI landscape. So there have been some innovations in industry that have intersected with academic research, and that is, Google Earth Engine, Google really has been pushing the envelope here, but using their AI tools, and they developed this Alpha Earth product recently, which is using their foundation DeepMind model to generate these it'll be on the next slide, that generating these embeddings from all of those satellite data that they have within their Google Earth Engine. And then also we have some physics-informed machine learning or surrogate models that we can develop, that have been developed from organizations like NVIDIA, which of course are developing a lot of the computing power and the computing chips that we use for running these models. So Google Earth Alpha has actually, this image or video is actually taken from the Google Earth Alpha website. So they've developed this highly spatially resolved 10 by 10 meter global coverage data set, which has basically taken all of their satellite data and assimilated them all together and used all of these as inputs. And then they've used the temporal sequences because much of those satellite data are observed daily or even more than once a day. And so they've actually created these frames, which is like a video for a given location, and they've enabled these models to capture the temporal dynamics. And what they've done is they've created these embeddings. This is 64-dimensional vector at this 10 by 10 meter pixel. And they've only created it annually. It's such a huge data set, but really they've used their Google DeepMind to generate these embeddings that can then be used to really represent the Earth. So the 64 embeddings don't really represent anything physical, but they do characterize different aspects of the Earth, which can be used. So this is a very new product. I haven't actually incorporated into my research myself yet, but it's an exciting product that they've developed, and people are starting to use it now. But what I have done is basically not used Google DeepMind. So that's an example that's been done there. But a few of us has been working in this area of physics-informed AI for air quality modeling. And in this case, what we've done is we've built models using satellite data. So here on the left, you can see all of the different, we have to incorporate climate model or meteorology data. We have to incorporate emissions data, a bunch of other different data on the vertical profile. But we built these multi-level graphs of spatial temporal neighbors and sort of these graph layers to simulate spatial spread in the pollutant transport dynamics. And so graph convolution has been used to simulate this spatial spread. And then the trend now, or one of the trends now, is to do this physics encoding to incorporate partial differential equations into the residual loss terms to regularize predictions towards something that's more physically plausible. So in this case, we've been using this advection plus diffusion minus deposition in the PDE here in the loss term in order to sort of constrain our predictions to being very physically plausible. So this is another schematic of what we've done here. So basically, embedding the physics into the AI models has improved extrapolation to unseen locations in space and time. As you can see, this is basically, we go from having some point data and some gridded data to making these predictions over these grids. So this is an example of California where we applied this before, where we generated daily 1 kilometer estimates of particulate matter and nitrogen dioxide. And so the other thing that we can do with these models is, which we're doing a lot more of now, because AI is obviously known as being kind of a black box, where we've generated uncertainty quantification through ensemble learning and a few other methods where we can generate prediction intervals, or we can do these ensembles to generate uncertainty estimates with our predictions. Another application of AI, more related a bit more to climate. So we use this training these large climate-based models that NASA has assimilated a lot of their satellite data together and generated these very coarse resolution, well, coarse meaning 50-kilometer resolution estimates of both the climate and air quality. And so we train these AI models to bring the coarse resolution data down to finer resolution. So we treat downscaling as a super resolution problem. So we're enhancing these coarse satellite imageries using fine scale predictors. We have very limited training data for this at the finer scale. So this is where we have to use sort of these complex training and data in order to learn the spatial detail, and then as well as the temporal detail. So in this particular case, we have this 50-kilometer resolution over a long period of time. And then we have a short period of time in which we have fine resolution data. So we have this short training period and this long out of sample prediction period where we want to have downscaled estimates. So this picture here just shows the coarse inputs. This would be what we're considering ground truth, which would just be the 7-kilometer. And then we make these predictions basically at this sort of finer resolution 7-kilometer scale. And what we have to do is we have to create this fairly complicated pipeline, which uses transfer learning. And the transfer learning allows us to extrapolate out of the sampling time period. So this is just a detail. It's a very busy slide with a lot of different steps here in our overall pipeline. But we have these small transfer encoder models with these unit spatial type models, and then we transfer that into a larger model, and then we can preserve sort of some of the temporal trends, but then extrapolate out with less, hopefully, less error in our predictions. So it's a little hard to test those because we're going way out of the sampling period in order for our predictions, but that's where things are trending now in sort of incorporating time series and spatial into some of these AI models. Okay, so I'll just wrap it up with some applications of these with the AI for the air pollution exposures that I showed you before. So we have we generate these prediction maps of physical quantity like particulate matter or nitrogen dioxide, but then we want to use these as exposures in a health effects study. So this is translating it. And I'm just going to present one of these applications, which is probably the most impactful application. So you probably have heard of the global burden of disease. So these studies have had significant impact on understanding risk factors associated with various outcomes, and risk factors including different things like obesity or high blood pressure, and also air pollution. So, to do these studies, they're global. So satellite data coupled with these AI models have been instrumental in determining global PM2.5 exposure estimates for the GBD studies. And one of the big findings came out last year in terms of using these for the AI for air quality was that they looked at data from 2021, and they found that air pollution was the second leading factor of mortality and is associated with 8.1 million deaths worldwide. Heart disease, stroke, diabetes, lung cancer, COPD account for 90% of the disease burden from air pollution. So these are the deaths associated with these accounting for 90% of the disease burden from air pollution. From the models, we found that 99% of the world's population lives in places with unhealthy levels of PM2.5, and then continuing to see, and we can see that in some of these areas here, in the boxes that count countries like in Asia and Africa and the Middle East continue to experience very high levels of ambient PM2.5. Okay, so in summary, just to drive home the point that big geospatial data, such as those obtained from satellites, are being used for environmental exposure assessment on a global scale. And then many of these are also used for downstream health studies. Statistical and AI approaches are needed to synthesize and generate meaningful quantities from these large data sets. There's still lots of challenges. We have very complex computing, so scalability is challenging. We have a need for interdisciplinary knowledge for all of this. We need collaborations needed between a whole bunch of players. Uncertainty and model bias are still underreported. And of course, there's data gaps that are particularly problematic, and such as the ground truth, which is for modeling and validation, but we use what we can. And there's lots of projects that are ripe for innovation in this area for wildfire forecasting, extreme forecasting, industrial monitoring, and then overall physics-informed AI, which I talked about today, incorporating things like graph neural networks, transfer learning, are really advancing the landscape for improved predictions and estimates to use as exposures in health effects studies. So thank you very much. And this is just a thanks to my collaborators at University of Toronto and USC, where I was previously, and colleagues all over the place who have contributed to this work. Thank you.
Amazing, Meredith. Thank you. I have to ask, so my understanding is AeroMod is often used to model, I think coming from like first principles, sort of maybe nitrogen oxides, for example.
Yeah, AirMod is like a deterministic model that would
Yes.
be just a physical model, no data. Like there's
No
input,
data
but not really data. It's not using data. Yeah.
And so we've just done some preliminary work in Nova Scotia because of we have these high rates of lung cancer and other things.
Mhm.
And just looked at AirMod output in relation to, say, like a very basic air quality monitor. And it's abysmal in terms of
Yeah.
close they come. So is what you're doing, like, will this be used for formal monitoring? I mean, I realize
Yeah, so I think that there's two things. Sometimes air mod can be used in situations that are more like scenario analysis, which are like climate models as well. You can project it into the future, and they have sort of a capability of doing that. But these models are way better at estimating, doing like retrospective analysis. So if we want to do a health effect study with health data that have been collected, we can generate these exposures from last year,
Yeah.
10 years before, and then you get much better estimates than AirMod would give. I think with this stuff that we're doing with transfer learning, for example, because we're going sampling out of the training window and we're getting good results, it's really hard to test because you still have to test where you have data.
Yeah.
There's promise there to be able to use some of these AI, physics-informed AI models to actually create scenarios and replace some of the physical models. But we need to use sort of what's going on in the back end of those physical models to really understand. But I think incorporating data into a lot of these physical models has really been helpful and does produce better estimates than using the physical models alone. So I think a coupled type of situation is much better than either one alone.
Great. Well, I think we are now officially over time. So thanks again, Meredith. It was wonderful, and best of luck to the next session.
Thank you.
And
Yeah.
congratulations to all the women participating today.